My husband, Daniel, died on a Tuesday morning in March of a heart attack at 44 years old in a hotel room in Richmond, Virginia, 3 hours from our home outside Raleigh, North Carolina. He was there, as far as I knew, for one of his regular work trips, quarterly visits to a regional office he'd helped establish years earlier for the medical supply company he'd worked at for most of our marriage. I got the call at 6:40 in the morning from a hotel manager, not a hospital, because by the time anyone found him, there had been nothing left for a hospital to do. I want to tell this story carefully and in order, because the order matters enormously to how much sense any of it makes, and because for the first several months after Daniel's death, I lived inside a version of events that I now understand was only half true, built from the pieces I had, without knowing an entire second half of the picture existed at all. Daniel and I had been married for 16 years. We met in our late 20s, married within 2 years, and built what I believed, right up until the moment everything changed, was a genuinely solid, if unremarkable, marriage. We had 2 children, Sophie, who was 14 when he died, and Marcus, who was 11. Daniel traveled for work regularly, 4 or 5 days a month, sometimes more during quarterly review periods, a pattern so consistent over our marriage that it had simply become part of the architecture of our lives, unremarkable in the way that long-standing patterns become invisible. The funeral was difficult in the ordinary, expected ways that funerals are difficult. What I didn't expect, what nothing in 16 years of marriage had prepared me for, was a phone call I received almost exactly 6 months after the funeral from a woman named Christine, calling from an area code I didn't recognize, asking, in a voice that was shaking audibly even through the phone, if she was speaking with Daniel Pierce's wife. I said yes, confused, assuming this was some work-related matter finally being settled months late, the kind of administrative loose end that death leaves scattered behind it for what feels like forever. There was a long pause on the line before Christine said, very quietly, "I think I might be his wife too." I want to describe what that sentence did to me physically, because I think it matters to understanding everything that came after. It didn't land as a sudden shock, the way you might expect. It landed slowly, in stages, like a building coming down floor by floor rather than all at once, each subsequent piece of information collapsing something new that the previous piece hadn't quite finished demolishing yet. Christine and I talked for almost 3 hours that first call, and what emerged, pieced together from both our fragments of the same man, was this. Daniel had married Christine 11 years into my own marriage to him in a small courthouse ceremony in a town 2 hours from where she lived, using paperwork that, as far as either of us could later determine, involved either a forged or fraudulently obtained marriage license, since he was, of course, still legally married to me the entire time. Christine had 2 children with him as well, a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, born during years I remembered him traveling more than usual, years I had attributed, without a second thought, to the demands of a demanding job at a company that was, by his own account, expanding rapidly during that period. He had told Christine that his job required him to travel to North Carolina regularly, the reverse of what he'd told me, and had built, as far as we could piece together, an entire second life running in parallel to mine for exactly 5 years before his death, a life with its own house, its own routines, its own children who called him Dad on weekday evenings just as mine did, none of us with any idea that we were sharing him, in secret, across a 3-hour drive that he apparently made with a regularity and a logistical precision that, in retrospect, must have required an almost professional level of planning and compartmentalization. The weeks after that first call from Christine were, I think, harder than the weeks immediately after Daniel's death itself, because grief for a whole person, even a flawed one, has a shape that human beings understand instinctively, a shape our culture gives us scripts for. But grief for a person who turns out to have been only half of who you thought he was, grief tangled up with a betrayal this total, doesn't have a script at all. I found myself grieving two different things simultaneously and could never quite separate them: grief for the man I'd lost, and a strange, disorienting grief for the marriage I'd believed I'd had, which, it turned out, had never fully existed in the shape I understood it to be. Christine and I met in person about a month after that first call from Christine, at a diner roughly halfway between our two homes, a location that felt, in a bitter and unintentional way, symbolic of the exact geographic arrangement Daniel had exploited for 5 years. I want to describe her honestly, because I think the instinct in a story like this is to cast the other woman as either a villain or a fool, and Christine was neither. She was, like me, a person who had trusted completely, who had built a life around a man's steady, reliable presence, who had 2 children who loved their father, and were now trying to process a loss that somehow, impossibly, gotten more complicated rather than less as time went on. We spent that first meeting largely comparing notes in a strange, clinical way that I think was the only way either of us could process the information without falling apart entirely. We compared our wedding dates. We compared the stories he'd told each of us about his work travel. We compared photographs, and I remember the specific nauseating vertigo of looking at a picture of Daniel at what was clearly a family Christmas at Christine's house, wearing a sweater I didn't recognize, standing in a living room I'd never seen, smiling the exact same smile I had 100 photographs of from our own Christmases, as though he'd simply had 2 identical settings of the same performance running on parallel tracks. The financial reckoning took much longer to untangle than the emotional one, and in some ways was almost easier to process because it at least came with documents, timelines, concrete facts that didn't shift depending on how raw I felt on a given day. It turned out that Daniel had taken out a second mortgage on our family home 18 months before his death, without my knowledge, using a signature that a handwriting analyst I eventually hired confirmed was very likely forged, not perfectly, but well enough to pass a busy loan officer's cursory review. The money from that second mortgage, roughly $90,000, had gone, as best forensic accountants could trace, primarily towards a down payment on the house he shared with Christine and towards ongoing support for that second household, meaning that for the final 18 months of his life, Daniel had been quite literally funding one family's home using debt secretly attached to the other family's home, a detail that, when I first understood it, made me physically sick in a way little else in this entire ordeal had. Christine, for her part, had her own financial shocks to process. Daniel had told her that his income was significantly higher than it actually was, apparently to explain away the periods when money was tight in her household. Periods that, once we compared timelines, appeared to correspond almost exactly to periods when he was under financial strain from maintaining 2 households at once, rather than any actual downturn in his real salary. I want to be honest about the ugliest part of this story, the part that I think people are often too polite to ask about directly, but that I know is the real curiosity underneath a story like this. Were the children, mine and Christine's, aware of each other at all? The answer, as far as we could ever determine, was no. Daniel had, with what I can only describe as a chilling level of discipline, kept every element of these 2 lives completely separate for 5 years. No overlapping social media, no shared friend groups, no accidental crossed wires that either family had ever noticed. My children knew their father traveled for work. Christine's children knew the same thing, in reverse. It was only his death, the one variable he couldn't manage or schedule around, that finally collapsed the wall between 2 lives he had spent years constructing with what must have been extraordinary, exhausting care. The legal aftermath took the better part of a year to resolve. Because Daniel's marriage to Christine had been legally invalid, given that he was still married to me at the time it occurred, Christine had no formal legal standing as a widow, no automatic claim to his estate, no survivor benefits through his employer, despite having built a life with him in every way that mattered practically, if not legally. I want to be honest that I had every legal right, in the aftermath, to simply let that reality stand, to keep whatever assets remained entirely within my own household, and let Christine's situation be a consequence of a fraud that, after all, I hadn't committed and hadn't benefited from either. I didn't do that, and I've thought a great deal since about why, because I don't think the reason was simple generosity, though I hope some of it was. Part of it was that Christine's children were, whatever the legal technicalities, genuinely Daniel's children, half-siblings to my own kids, and some instinct in me recoiled at the idea of two children losing their father and then also losing any material stability because of a fraud they had absolutely no part in and no knowledge of. Part of it, if I'm honest, was that punishing Christine financially for Daniel's deception felt like directing anger at the wrong target entirely, a target that happened to be reachable specifically because she, like me, had been deceived rather than complicit. I ended up, after a long process involving multiple attorneys and more difficult conversations than I can easily count, agreeing to a private settlement with Christine that split what remained of Daniel's estate after the fraudulent mortgage was accounted for and the resulting financial damage was distributed as fairly as our lawyers could manage, in a way that gave both households something to rebuild from, rather than leaving one family whole and the other devastated. It wasn't a court-mandated outcome. It was, as strange as this sounds given everything that led to it, a decision two wronged women made together across a diner table and then many subsequent conversations, because we had both quickly realized that whatever anger either of us wanted to direct at each other made far more sense directed at the man who was no longer present to receive any of it. Christine and I are not close, not in any warm, easy sense, but we speak periodically, mostly logistics at this point, occasionally something closer to genuine solidarity, two people bound together by an experience nobody else in our lives can fully understand. My children know, now, that they have half-siblings, an arrangement we are all still, slowly figuring out how to navigate, tentative video calls between Sophie and Christine's older daughter, a shared, confusing grief that none of them asked for and none of them fully understand yet, being processed at the pace that children process things, in fits and starts, with long, quiet stretches in between. I think about Daniel less as a monster now than I did in the earliest months, though I want to be careful not to let that softening slide into something like forgiveness I don't actually feel. What he did required a level of sustained, deliberate deception that I don't think can be fully explained away by weakness or confusion, or whatever gentler word people reach for when trying to make sense of a betrayal this large. He built two entire families and spent 5 years actively, carefully, exhaustingly managing the wall between them, a wall that only ever came down because his heart gave out in a hotel room 3 hours from either home, a location that I've since learned was almost exactly the midpoint between the two lives he'd been splitting himself across the whole time. I don't have a tidy conclusion for this story, because I don't think betrayal on this scale resolves into anything tidy. What I have instead is a strange, unchosen extended family, two sets of children slowly learning to understand each other, a woman I never wanted to know who has become someone I now trust more than I trusted my own husband for at least the final 5 years of his life, and a grief that has never fully separated into clean categories of what I lost versus what I never actually had to begin with.